All right, hi everyone, and welcome to webinar 6, Cover Crops and Diversifying Cropping Systems of the Soil Health Training Program webinar series. Today is Tuesday, January 23rd. We want to thank the Lake Champlain Basin Program and NUI-PIC again for the funding to create and host this training program. Quick agenda as per usual, do a course overview, a homework review, and then we'll have Julie Fine present some information about cover crops and crop diversification. And then we'll hold questions for the Q&A after her full presentation, and then we'll talk about what the next class is going to bring. So again, kind of where are we in the course? We're actually at webinar 6 of 12, so that's pretty exciting. We've made it halfway through almost. And next week we'll have Jeff Sanders and Abby Augarten with minimizing tillage. And just a quick review of the homework. I know there was a lot of reading, but I hope folks were able to get to it. And so we read chapters 10 and 11, one on cover crops and one on diversifying cropping systems. And there was a lot of great information and also a lot of great reference information to go back to throughout your time working with farmers. I definitely will, because I'm sure not everything's stuck. And then I want to introduce Julie Fine. Julie is the Climate and Agriculture Specialist at American Farmland Trust New England, or AFT New England. She researched the effects of cover crops on nutrient cycling and soil health to earn a MS from the Stockbridge School of Agriculture at UMass Amherst. Through experiences as a farmer, researcher, and ag service provider, Julie has seen the agricultural and climate challenges that food producers face in New England. She is inspired to work together with farmers and their supporters towards site-specific solutions for climate adaptation, soil health, and sustainable food production. With that, Julie, if you'd like to start sharing your screen and take over, we'll let you go from here.
I gotta remember to unmute. All right, how's that look?
That looks great.
It's funny because I can't see any now. But I wonder if maybe anyone who has a little bit of experience with cover crops, if you want to pop your favorite cover crop species into the box. I'm sort of curious to know if people have favorites, if there are things that they are more interested in learning about, or cover crop species they love. It's just nice to sort of see a little input in the chat to start with. So as Lauren mentioned, I'm the Climate and Agriculture Specialist with AFT New England. I love tillage radish too. And I've started out my career as an organic vegetable farmer, went back to school for plant and soil science. And now my work really focuses on soil health and climate adaptation with AFT New England. And I'm really happy to be here with you today. I could talk about cover crops all day and not get tired of it. They're one of my favorite topics. And glad to see that some of you have some favorite cover crop species too. So let's see if I can advance this here. So this is always tricky because it's hard to know how many of you have had a lot of experience with cover crops, how many of you read those relevant chapters. So I don't want to get too basic, but I also want to make sure that we cover all the important stuff. Cover crops are really amazing because they serve all of these multiple functions, right? They provide physical protection for the soil, they capture and release nutrients, they're sort of doing it all. They feed the soil, they suppress weeds. Some species are better than others at all of these things, right? So they each have their strengths and their weaknesses. And what's really cool about them, I think, is that you sort of fit them all together to serve your purposes, depending on whatever the needs of your farm or that particular field are. You can mix them together so that you have a cover crop mixture of multiple species that adjust to environmental conditions. You can feed them to animals. You can use them to do physical aeration of soil. And I think part of what I love about them is that they're just this really dynamic process, right? Where you're actually utilizing the whole soil carbon system. You're capturing that solar energy having the plants use that to break down CO2 to make carbohydrates to feed themselves. And then they also feed the soil while they're feeding themselves. And then you're cycling through and releasing oxygen into the universe, into the atmosphere, into the universe. That's funny. So, it's this whole amazing food plant web. And I think that that's sort of part of the beauty of it, is that you're like really seeing all of that cycling. And it also is the real challenge and limitation in New England is that, we have this very short growing season. That solar energy is really limited. We have this many months of the year that are short or where the sun is not as strong. And so we don't have quite as much potential to even use cover crops as there are in other warmer climates. I think that's like a really important thing to just start out by talking about, because while they look like they have this multitude of virtues and they can do almost anything, they also have this really limited time windows. We have 5 months a year to actually grow food, and so we need to be growing food. It's hard to fit cover crops into that scheme. Whoa, excuse me. So I think that maybe that's sort of the first thing that I want to say, is that like cover crops are only valuable if they provide value to the farmer. And as you all are going out into the world and thinking about how to advocate for cover crops and healthy soils, I think that finding the place in this list of things that farmers really need and really value, could they be growing cover crops that also double as animal feed? Are they alleviating compaction that's like really limiting crop production? Whatever place a farmer might find value in it is the place where they're going to make time and space for growing cover crops. I was just going to note, I'm sure you've seen this since this is a soil health class, but I think that this is sort of what's cool about cover crops, is that they you can include them in every aspect of these soil health principles. They do all of the above if you use them right. They also can contribute to some bad things, right? Like you can plant cover crops badly and get runoff. You can use a lot of tillage to incorporate cover crops into the soil. So like anything, you have to use it wisely. I think that I put together this graphic, even though it's like a little boring to look at, because I think that it provides a little bit of structure in terms of how I go about thinking about cover crops when I am going to a new farm. So I'm like, start by thinking like, what are those soil health goals? Like, so that initial list, like, what does the farmer really need? Are they dealing with a lot of compaction? Are they looking at using cover crops to do nitrogen fixation and feed subsequent cash crops? Are they just looking for like winter soil protection to prevent erosion? So like really identifying the specific goals for individual fields or the farm as a whole. And then the second thing is to look at like initial soil health and fertility. So a lot of farms, if they're not managing their soil pH well, which I see more often than you would, I mean, you probably all see that too, but like there are a shocking number of soil tests I get back with a 5.5 soil pH, and cover crops don't like that either. So starting with well-managed soil pH is really important. And there also can be issues with fertility. If you're putting cover crops down in a super low fertility field and it's not the right cover crop that can provide its own nutrients, there are times when you actually have to really fertilize a cover crop to get it to grow well. So, starting by just not assuming that cover crops can do it all for you is the right place to start. You're also going to like really think about what season you have time to plant a cover crop, given the farmer's production system, and what field. It might be that it's like every field gets it once every 4 years, or it might be that there's like some annual system in place, but like really looking at what fits into the existing system and not sort of assuming that the system will change for a cover crop. And then looking at crop planning, like, especially in vegetable farms, people have to be really strategic about where to fit in their cover crop, because it could only fit in early if it's a late season cash crop or vice versa. But really making cover crop planning part of your crop planning, I think, is one of the ways to actually make it successful. If you don't plan it in, it's often sort of falls off the table. It's just another thing to plant, another thing to manage. So I think that sort of looking at it as a whole system can be really helpful. The next thing I have in here is cover crop termination, which sounds like kind of obvious, but you would be surprised how many people like plant a cover crop and then they're like, I'll figure it out. But they don't actually have the equipment they need to do what they want with it. We'll talk a little bit more about termination methods, but really figuring out like it's easy to plant, but can you kill it? That's important. And then weed control can be a really serious concern because you can actually create pretty serious weed problems by mismanaging a cover crop or planting the wrong species. So thinking about not just weed control in terms of getting sort of good weed suppression, but also thinking about what's the next crop that's going to follow this cover crop and can it handle whatever weed seed bank is there. And then lastly, just thinking about crop fertility. So what's coming after the cover crop, and is it using primarily nutrients from a decomposing cover crop, or are you not counting on the cover crop to actually provide the fertility, or using the cover crop for other of its benefits? But really sort of doing an assessment of how much of your crop fertility is coming from a cover crop is really important. Sometimes people really assume that there's more there than there is, or sometimes they assume there's nothing there when they're actually getting, 50 pounds of N per acre, and they could really take advantage of that. So those are sort of like the things that I think about when I'm like approaching a new cover cropping opportunity. And then we'll go through a little bit of the more like New England specifics. And I'm just going to keep an eye on time here because I think I could talk forever. There's a bunch of different ways to categorize cover crops. I kind of like looking at them this way because these are kind of your three major functions. So you have nitrogen fixers, you have nitrogen scavengers, and you have cover crops that are weed suppressors or biomass producers. And these are a list of the species that people, or the cover crops that most people in New England utilize. There are many, many cover crop species out there. Some do better in different climates. This is sort of what people use in our region. And in some ways, like sort of the top 2 or 3 items on each of those lists are the most common things. There's like a remarking amount of similarity. You see a tremendous amount of winter rye there. But all the nitrogen fixers, right, have a symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria, and they are taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and putting it in their little cover crop bodies. All of the scavengers have mostly pretty deep roots that are pulling residual nitrogen out of the soil profile and holding it in their leaves and roots. And suppressors are just things that are growing a lot of biomass to outcompete other weeds. So these serve important functions, and as you're selecting cover crops, you kind of want to think about like what you're using the cover crop species for. And as I mentioned from the beginning, you're looking at the goals of your cover crop, and you actually kind of want to go through and like list them out for each specific field. Like, what do I want? First of all, I want physical protection for winter, or I want to be adding carbon to my soil. And then you're going to choose a cover crop species based on those goals, because you can't get everything that you need from one cover crop. It's hard to get it from 2. And then we'll talk later about mixtures, because you can definitely get multiple functions from multiple species. But then I think that both the beauty and the challenge of cover crops is that you're looking for both nutrient capture and nutrient release, and finding a way to balance that as part of your soil health goals. I wanted to talk about that a little more in detail because it's so important, and because in New England I see so many farms just growing winter rye. And if you let that go to full maturity, you can get a really carbonaceous, super stemmy cover crop that decomposes slowly and can cause a lot of trouble in the soil, like clumps, and lots of stems that make it hard to transplant or direct seed. So a soil microorganism needs a diet with a carbon to nitrogen ratio of about 24:1 to really actively decompose and release nutrients at a timeline that plants can use them. And so when you look at that, like a mature alfalfa hay is around that. So you really need more than winter rye if you're going to try and get a sort of quick releasing cover crop. And there are a lot of resources out there to sort of calculate that carbon to nitrogen ratio. I'll mention one in the resource list at the end. That's something to always be concerned about. I also wanted to just mention that, like, there's all these different ways to classify cover crops. Like, you can talk about the nitrogen scavengers and you can talk about weed suppressors, but you could also look at their root architectures, which I think is a really kind of cool thing to think about. We are always looking at things above ground. It's hard to look at things below ground. There's like an amazing lack of scientific research on roots. Because they're hard to dig up and they're hard to quantify. But interesting research had looked at soil organic matter, and we found that it's composed of 50% root carbon and only 13% shoot carbon, meaning that like all of those root exudates from living roots are going into the soil. They're going into these little soil aggregates. Microbes are consuming them. Their populations are like bacterial populations are growing, fungal populations are growing, and using all of that carbon. And that's what really stays in the soil. Like, because it's already in contact with soil aggregates and it's like really protected, and it stays in the soil. And anything, so, when I was a farmer and I was thinking about above ground biomass when I was growing cover crops, we grew a lot of oats and peas, a lot of rye, some bell beans. I started farming in California. And I was always thinking like, oh, look at all of that above ground biomass that's going into the soil. All of that is going to be converted to soil organic matter. But I've been really interested to learn that like roots are actually more powerful in terms of adding stable carbon to soils. So thinking about how to get a combination of both like deep roots and really fibrous, hairy roots, I think is kind of a cool way also to think about designing cover crop practices. If you use multiple species, you can get the advantages of both. And, sort of as a general rule of thumb, all the grasses tend to be more fibrous rooted, and the legumes and forbs tend to be more deeply rooted. And then there are a few things that have both fibrous roots and deep roots. But I think that's an interesting thing to really think about if one of your main goals in terms of soil health is sequestering carbon. I thought I was going to talk a little bit about cover crop termination. And I don't know how many of you are working with organic farms versus conventional farms, but you basically have 4 ways to terminate a cover crop. And the cover crops that you select might be dependent on what you have to kill them with. So a lot of folks who are growing winter rye, it's much easier to use winter rye if you can kill it with chemicals, because then it doesn't require a tremendous amount of tillage. But one of the challenges that I see working with organic vegetable farmers is that they plant winter rye because it's easy to get established, and then in the spring they're really in a crunch to get it terminated before it's too big, basically, and it's harder to kill. They have to go through and they have to use they have to plow. Sometimes they have to plow multiple times, and they don't, terminating that winter rye is a real challenge. So I just think that like thinking about how you want to kill things. Like, do you really want to plow your fields every single year? Are you able to use like a flail mower to terminate your cover crops? And that might take 1 or 2 passes to do it, but people are experimenting more with using alternative ways to terminate rye in particular. A lot of folks have been using roller crimpers for a number of years, which is really time sensitive. It works pretty darn well as long as you get the timing right. Hopefully some of you are working with farmers who are already doing this. We see a lot of folks having success with this when they're growing field corn, silage corn. And I would say it's like the most common no-till practice in New England is using winter rye, sometimes winter rye combined with vetch, and rolling and crimping it, and then no-till planting into that rolled and crimped rye. I also see a lot of smaller scale growers using occultation tarps, or sometimes cardboard, to kill cover crops and the weeds that come along with cover crops. And that, tends to work on scale out to an acre or so. And although I do have farmers who are tarping a half an acre at a time, just kind of depends on how dedicated you are to tarping. But I think having the tools that you need to kill a cover crop is as important as planting a cover crop. I think that's what I'm trying to say. So when you're talking to farmers about how they might fit them into your system, one of the first questions is that. All right. There's kind of a lot of words on the screen, but this is sort of in my mind how I classify cover crops. Like you can go into a cover crop book and it's like all these funky species, and you're like, Alsace clover, that looks really interesting. But like in the end, you have to figure out like how they're going to fit into your growing season and what they're going to do for you. And so this is what I see, in our climate. This is what people primarily are using cover crops when they're using them and what they're using them for. So they're using a winter killed low residue cover crop. So it's something that's planted in the fall, like oats and peas or radish. It's like you have to get it planted a little earlier, like early September, to get it to really establish well and produce biomass. But it's awesome because it's winter killed. So come spring, it's dead and you don't have to manage it at all. You can either seed right into it or just do it, a quick harrow and get into the ground. You're not having to manage the cover crop come spring. The disadvantage of that is that you don't have living roots all winter. You have a lower residue, so you're not adding as much carbon, you're not adding as much nitrogen. And if there's a lot of spring rain, you'll kind of leach out a lot of the nitrogen that cover crop held in the fall. So there's advantages and disadvantages. High residue winter hardy cover crops are planted in fall. They usually are really small over the course of the winter. Then they grow really quickly in the spring and produce a lot of biomass in spring, and then they're incorporated. If you're, the best examples of these are winter rye and hairy vetch. Hairy vetch is kind of the only legume that really overwinters in our climate totally reliably. Sometimes a lot of people have good luck with Dutch clover. Sometimes you can get a crimson clover to overwinter, but those are like the real primary species that people use for winter hardy cover crops around here. And again, they have their pros and cons. They can be time sensitive in spring to get them either incorporated or killed. But they're really great, especially if you're not trying to get them incorporated and decompose really quick. They're awesome for like fall planted broccoli or August planted broccoli, for field corn, for growing pumpkins, things where you're not putting them in until June. So that's one category. The next category is like summer suppression. So either weed suppression or sometimes just sort of holding a piece of ground and cycling nutrients for the next round of crops. So the most common ones of species are buckwheat, or I don't see that many people using sun hemp, but Sudan grass is super common. So those are planted once the soil and weather warms. They're usually either mowed or just people let them go all summer. And then you can either let them winter kill or you can terminate them and plant a fall crop. And then the last kind of functional group are these green manures. And you're basically growing cover crops to take up nutrients and cycle that fertility right to the following crop. So really good examples of that are like spring planted crimson clover, oats and peas. So you have to use the growing season to grow those. So usually it's kind of a quick cycle. You're like planting it in spring, terminating it, and then putting your cash crop in say July or August, and just making use of those nutrients as soon as you can. So we'll look a little more at each of one of these categories, and I'll talk about a little more examples in our climate. So if you've seen any fields in winter, you've seen winter rye growing. Like it has, let's see, I'm trying to move my Zoom bar. It's in my, oh well. So there's disadvantages to rye. It doesn't fix nitrogen, but it's an amazing nitrogen scavenger. It has really deep roots, and it's able to scavenge nitrogen that's residual from a summer crop super effectively. Pros and cons: it has high biomass. You have to deal with the biomass. So if that's what you want, that's great. If you don't want to deal with the biomass, that's a disadvantage. I'd say that, like, again, it has this pro and con where you can plant it really late. Like you can plant winter rye. Well, you guys are mostly in Vermont, so here, I see people planting it until December 1st probably, and it'll germinate. Depending on the year, of course. But people like it because they can plant it really late and it'll come up and they're like, yes, I planted a cover crop. but you really have to get winter rye in early, enough to get established and to get some root biomass. Otherwise, it's not scavenging any nitrogen. You're just sort of feeling good about yourself because you see little shoots on the surface of your soil. So I would say one of the other things that I talk to farmers about is just finding ways if they can even get their winter rye in, like 2 weeks earlier. Um, they can broadcast rye over their cash crop and then go back and like mow their cash crop down on top of it. That's one way that sometimes people will get rye in earlier. Some people are interseeding rye and other cover crops just to get them established a little earlier. But like every 2 days in September and October is worth 2 weeks in the summer in terms of growing power. So I would say that that's like actually like a powerful place of leverage if you're working with farmers to improve cover crop practices, is just to try and get winter rye planted in a more timely way. So we see folks using this in all kinds of ways. They establish it in fall. They'll spray it. Sometimes they'll spray it in spring when the plants are 6 inches tall and just disc it right in. Some people grow it like in this middle picture here where they're growing huge amounts of biomass and then they're either mowing it or rolling it. The picture on the right is showing some nice no-till corn that's planted directly into rolled rye. And we have a lot of farmers in Connecticut and Massachusetts who are having pretty reliable luck growing corn that way. So we go back to this winter hardy. That's the best example of a winter hardy high residue cover crop. But we also have lots of folks mix hairy vetch into that because it's an overwintering legume. They get additional nitrogen fixation. Sometimes hairy vetch can get away from you. They're like, depending on the weather, sometimes the rye isn't mature at the same time as the vetch. You can have trouble killing both of them if you're rolling and crimping. So you have to sort of make sure that the rye is fully mature. It's like it's sent out its anthers, it's getting pollinated, it's starting to actually form seeds, and then you can really reliably kill rye. And vetch should be at least at 50% flour in order to reliably kill it by rolling. So there are definitely people who've had to do some weird things where they roll the rye at the right time and they have to go back and mow in the vetch. But that could be like a disadvantage of mixing species. But the advantage is you get great carbon to nitrogen ratio, you get nitrogen fixation from that vetch cover crop, and you get really nice fertility and good decomposition. We're also seeing more people doing some interesting things with kind of low residue transplanting. I guess we'll talk about that a little more. So these are things like peas and oats where people plant them a little earlier, and then you have a non-hardy cover crop. Winter kills, and then that center picture is a photograph of a no-till corn planter planting into oat and pea and forage radish residue. So it's a really light residue. The awesome thing is that you have these warm spring soils. You don't have any cooling from the big biomass and heavy canopy of a big winter rye cover crop. So the advantages of warm soil, and the disadvantages, you don't have any weed suppression. You can just sort of see right through. All the weeds are very happy to terminate in that little sunny plot there. So again, there are pros and cons. There are lots of vegetable farmers who love these winter killed cover crops because you can get in early, you can plant your spring lettuce, your peas and spinach and greens, and it's a good part of a diversified system if you have some areas that are in these low residue winter killed cover crops. So for summer weed suppression, I mean, buckwheat is like by far everybody's favorite. It's like hard to screw up planting a buckwheat cover crop. You can spread it. You hardly have to incorporate it. It can germinate with barely any soil moisture. It's awesome. The bees love it. It's so good for pollinators, and it's really easy to kill. So that is like an obvious, and the seed is very affordable. It's an obvious solution. There are also lots of folks who are growing Sudan grass or mixtures of all of these things. Either you can graze animals on them, so you still get the weed suppression, and then you also can be producing feed. There's some folks that I know who are playing around with Japanese millet. I've also seen some folks who just sort of take all their leftover cover crop seeds, throw them in a bin, and including cilantro and flowers and whatever, and just sort of throw them out and get a wild mix for summer suppression, because anything will outcompete, anything that's growing vigorously should outcompete weeds if it's planted well. And I think that's kind of a fun idea. The last thing I want to mention in this realm is looking at seeding into furrows. So I have a lot of farmers, especially this year with all the insane rain, you know, where they saw a lot of erosion down the tractor furrow. And there's also, in wet seasons, just huge problems in terms of crop production with just having wet beds. It's hard to get a truck in there. It's hard to have people like up to their, you know, calves in mud. And I had a few farmers who've been growing teff in between, like say in between their tomato beds, or you know, growing teff in between like beds of summer squash or pumpkins, where you have to go through and you have to mow the teff, you know, every 2 weeks or so to keep it a manageable height, maybe a foot high. But also they saw tremendous soil erosion prevention during the heavy July and August rains. And you have all those living roots all season. So it's like, it serves the function of both suppressing summer weeds in your in between your beds, but also really improving soil health in that area. You know, so it's like a foot of cover crop and then 4 feet of bed. But it's doing some good work for you. So if we're talking about green manure, it's funny, I don't hear people use that word here. I don't know if it's like a California term, but it is you know, you'll find it in any good cover cropping book. But the idea of growing cover crops like purely for crop fertility, you're like growing your own fertilizer. And it was something that people started talking about a little more, you know, right post-COVID, when fertilizer prices went through the roof. It's like you can grow a lot of fertility if you have the space. And I think that's a real issue for New England farmers, that I think a lot of folks don't have a land base that they feel like really supports their farm in terms of having enough land to grow sufficient cover crops. But if that isn't a primary limitation for a farmer, green manure is so affordable. You can fix a lot of nitrogen, you can grow a lot of carbon, and just promptly recycle that to a cash crop. You know, the folks that I know who are doing that best, it's usually sort of preceding fall crops like fall lettuces and fall cabbages, kales, Swiss chards, other fall greens, because you can use the growing power of spring and early summer and produce a lot of biomass. The thing that's most important to remember is that you're counting on that cover crop to decompose to be available for your plants, right? So if you look at this graph, I think this is something that I learned from the folks at UMass Extension when I was in grad school, is that like often the availability of that green manure or that decomposition, it doesn't meet up with your crop demand necessarily. So it's something to really look at. Like if you're incorporating your cover crop, usually people wait 2 weeks before they start planting or transplanting a cash crop into it. But that cover crop doesn't really mineralize and become available until week 4 or so. It's maximally available at that point. But often your peak crop demand is sort of at 6 to 8 weeks, depending on what your cash crop is. And so there's this real gap between when the maximum amount of nitrogen is available to your crop and when your crop needs the most nitrogen. And so I think that it's important, if you have folks who are thinking about growing their own fertilizer in this way, growing their own nitrogen, that often you still need to like put down a little bit of side dress nitrogen at peak crop demand in order to really meet the crop's needs for maximum yield. But I definitely have folks who like use green manures to provide 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre for a cash crop, and then they put like 30 pounds of N down at side dress and save themselves a lot of money that way. And then other folks, I didn't mention this, but in the winter killed cover crop function, there's some cool stuff going on with winter killed cover crops for sweet corn, because it's actually a really nice way to have warm spring ground, but have like a little bit of fertility available for sweet corn. So you can kind of no-till plant into that winter killed cover crop residue and then just side dress to supplement the for sufficient nitrogen. Um, so, and then I have like a whole handout that I'm going to send to Lauren, along with the list of resources that are at the end of this presentation. But cover crop mixtures are increasingly popular and really interesting. There's sort of two ways to do it, right? So like the photo on the left is you can mix cover crops like spatially, so that you're planting, like if you have a seed drill, or you can use some other kind of seeder, you can plant 3 or 4 rows of rye or oats and then plant 1 row of legumes. And what's cool about it is then you can go back and like this on the left is this example of planting corn into that radish row. So those radishes are really aerating that row. They're also bringing up a lot of nitrogen and some phosphorus from deeper. And then you get a little bit of weed suppression from the grass in between the rows of corn. So this is something that it works really well if you have a tractor driver who can drive straight and plant precisely where you want the following spring. A lot of people don't have that, I've learned. So that can be useful. I think a lot of other folks are just doing multi-species mixtures that serve their functions in other ways. So like, a really classic winter-killed mixture is peas, oats, and radish. But people who are able to grow summer cover crops are having fun with like planting all kinds of crazy stuff. They're throwing sunflower, sun hemp, and they're doing like 12 species mixes. And I would say that it's a great idea, but I have definitely looked into the science of it, and like keeping it at like a mixture of like 4 or 5 species is the most effective in terms of getting the function you want out of those species, and just making sure that they're compatible and complementary, so that you have some that are tall that are going to fill a taller architectural space, and you have some that are fibrous rooted and others that are deeply rooted, so they're not competing in that root zone. And just thinking about the mixture like in terms of how they fill space and function in a system. And I have here's some examples. This is like probably not worth going through individually, but here's some examples of what I see out in the world. And they depend on when you have time to plant them and how you can kill them. Like I see a lot of conventional farmers who like planting Freya annual ryegrass. It's often really hard for organic farmers to kill that quite effectively enough to make it worth planting. So I see it used much more commonly with conventional growers. But there are lots of options, and they're definitely, I think one of the cool things about them is that they adapt when you have like a really wet or a really dry season. So whatever cover crop is able to tolerate a wet summer like we had last one will grow a little better. In a really droughty year, the Sudan grass will take off, and you always have something that can respond to the conditions that it's planted in. And that's really the biggest advantage of those mixtures. I wanted to bring your attention to this great tool that the Northeast Cover Crops Council has developed. It's available online. You can actually use it for, you can select your state or your region, and you go through and first you select your location, and then you actually put in your soil type and your site conditions. Is it particularly well drained, or and then you select your goals. Like, are you primarily in it for nitrogen fixation? Are you primarily looking for weed suppression? And then you click next, and it produces this list of cover crop species, and it shows you. It's a little hard to see. I don't know why it got blurred out here, but like, can you see how there's a crop name that says soybean, and that says goal 1 and goal 2. So it actually ranks the effectiveness of that cover crop for that goal. So here, I think goal 1 was nitrogen scavenging, and goal 2 was I can't remember, soil production or something. But it'll let you know like which species are more effective for the goals that you're looking for. So this, if you don't have a ton of experience selecting your own cover crops, this is a great tool. And then I have some other tools that I've listed in the resource document that are tools for creating multi-species cover crop mixtures, because there's some cool what do you call them, like calculations you can do to get the right seeding rate once you've mixed multiple species. So that's a really nice tool that's now available. There's also a Midwest cover crop calculator, but this one takes into consideration our growing season and what grows well here. So I think that next I just want to talk about like I guess this is really just sort of in summary that like I feel like cover crops are a place where it's kind of easy to get like lost in the fantasy of how great they are and how multiple function how many multiple functions they can provide, and then like you get to reality and it's just messier. Like there are always weeds and there are always challenges getting it established, and some species do better than others. So I think that like it's really important when you start to just like be very specific with your strategy. You're not going to get everything that you want from even a multi-species cover crop. So like really knowing what you're trying to get out of cover crop selection is critical. I mentioned at the beginning, but just making sure that your cover crops have the conditions that they need to thrive for germination. You know, they have sufficient soil moisture and a balanced soil pH. Next, I would say that like sometimes, like I think the biggest challenge in New England is timing, like having that cover crop either in the ground on time. A lot of the nitrogen fixing cover crops you have to either plant really early in the fall before most people are quite ready for it, or you have to really let them grow into the growing season to get sufficient nitrogen fixation. So like really being practical about the timing of it is super important, and knowing how time sensitive termination is also such an issue. Like if you're counting on rolling and crimping your cover crop, you need to have like a 3-week window where you have that roller crimper available to you, and where you don't have to get crops into the ground necessarily. You have a little flexibility. So you don't want to do that maybe on your whole farm. You want to pick, you know, a percentage of acreage that is where you have that flexibility. And then yeah, I mentioned at the beginning, just making sure that both your initial fertility, like that the cover crops have enough fertility to grow, and also that you're not over or underestimating how much fertility you're going to get from the cover crop. There's a really amazing tool available on the internet that's called Calculating Plant Available Nitrogen, and I'll send you guys a link to it, but it's from Oregon State. And it's just this great tool for like, you can basically measure how tall your cover crop is, what species are included, and it can calculate how much nitrogen is going to be mineralized from that cover crop. They also teach you how to, if you want to actually send forage samples or cover crop samples off to a lab, they teach you how to do that too if you want like actual numbers. But they also teach you how to estimate it. I think that's just a really cool tool that is available for all of us. And then the last thing is just like weeds. They just grow better than anything else. And they last so long in the soil. Okay. What time is it? We have 15 minutes. Yeah, I guess we'll take a break at 3. So the chapter in the book about diversification is really awesome. Like, and there's also this incredible resource on crop rotation that Lauren will send you with all my list of resources. That's published by SARE. And crop rotation and crop diversification are so complicated. I feel like it's a huge topic and so site specific. So in some ways, when I was preparing this, I was like, people should just read that chapter. so I do want to encourage you to read that chapter. And if you're really interested in diving deeper into crop rotation, look at the SARE publication. It's focused on organic farming. I think it's called Crop Rotation for Organic Farms, but it's applicable for everyone. I think it's designed for organic farmers because of their limited ability to manage for pests and diseases, but it's relevant for all of us. I would say that like what I have seen across New England is like that diversification is a form of climate adaptation, and and that there's many forms of diversification that are really powerful right now, and that people are kind of considering and reconsidering. So some of that is like what crops they're growing. Like I think historically it was just a little safer to like have a huge percentage of your farm be producing one or two crops, and that increasingly we're seeing with climate change, we're seeing precipitation that is just wiping out a crop because of high humidity and fungal pathogens, or just wet feet and being too wet to grow well. People lost thousands and thousands of acres of just lettuce from being wet last summer. So I think that people are just thinking more about like, how do I diversify what I'm growing to reduce risk? And some of that is really tricky because it means finding new markets, but that's also a form kind of risk reduction, right? And I think that the folks that I work with who had real community support over the last 2 years of flooding and drought found that like having diverse markets was incredibly valuable, because they had some markets that didn't really care that their farms were flooded and kind of were really bummed they couldn't fulfill their production contracts, and other farms where they had community supported agriculture and felt like people really had their back, despite the flooding loss. So I feel like when we talk about diversification, we can talk about crop rotation all day long, but we also really need to talk about looking at the business as a whole. And some of that is also just like time diversification. Like when weather events are really extreme like that, it slows everything down. And like finely tuned operations had a lot of trouble like keeping up with just planting successions. And there were all of these subsequent sort of fallout consequences of and one thing I just noticed is that like farms who have a balance where they have livestock and they have a maple operation and they have like a small market garden, but they're sort of diversified over the growing seasons, were a little buffered and just a little more economically stable. So as you're talking to farmers, I think that's one thing to sort of ask questions about, is like, questions about not just what crops they're growing and not just what markets they have for them, but also like what times of year they really feel like they have bandwidth and when they don't. Although it seems like sort of a dumb question, because it seems like no farmers have a lot of extra bandwidth these days. But I would say lastly, like I definitely see people who are looking more into growing perennials, because with increasingly wet springs and increasingly unpredictable extreme precipitation events, having some perennials in the mix just seems to buffer things a little bit. So I have folks who are looking more into fruit trees and asparagus and different things that they don't have to replant every year, so that if it is a really wet spring, they have something else going on. And there's a huge, I know that you have Megan coming to talk to you in a couple of weeks about agroforestry, so I won't go into that, but that's definitely expanding. And there are increasing amounts of financial support for farms who are trying to diversify into agroforestry and increase their soil health practices. And I know in Massachusetts, we also have a grant that's opening up now for folks who want to expand agrotourism. But I think that like, we're definitely seeing, I think across New England, we're definitely seeing this real interest in crop diversification, even though in some ways it makes farming systems more complicated. It also makes them more resilient. And I think people who have diversified in various ways are experiencing that in these really difficult growing seasons. I'm just going to give a few examples of that. So we work with Simple Gifts Farm doing some research on their reduced tillage cropping systems. And they're also a farm that has, over the years integrated livestock into their vegetable production. They have a farm store, and I think one of the things that I found really interesting that they're doing is that they have this like really cool system that's like sort of in heavy mulching, where they actually grow their own mulch, and they have this amazing Italian mulch harvester where they can actually like grow their own green mulch, cut it, move it to a different part of the farm, and put like 5 inches of mulch down on their tomatoes, and grow and cycle nutrients that way, and have this beautiful mulch all summer. And it's awesome. It's hard to do unless you have that really specific equipment. But the part of their operation that I think is really interesting is that they also have, over the last few years, really intensified their their intensive growing system. So they also have this kind of market garden of really short season successive crops. So it's a lot of salanova and radishes and baby leaf things and herbs, where they have these 1/4 acre blocks, and they're using tarps and moving the tarps like every 2 weeks across the landscape. And so they have this kind of 3-acre block of their 10-acre farm that's in this intensive cropping system. And I think that this is like a really nice example of how people are diversifying, in terms of they're not using the same equipment and the same system across their vegetable production. They're having different strategies that work better for different things. And I think it's a nice example of a way that's made them really successful. They're not tilling at all during those 3 years that they're using tarps in that acreage. And then they're moving, at the end of 3 years, they move out of that and they start doing that tarping system in a different part of the farm. And then this part of the farm goes back into yearly tillage. But in the meanwhile, they've built some awesome soil organic matter. They've reduced weeds a ton, and they just find that it really fits into their rotation well. And so I think these kinds of like split operations, where there's like really different strategies depending on the crop and the rotation, is important to look at. Another kind of diversification that I see being really successful is like product and market diversification. So there's a couple examples of a farm in Western Mass. Atlas Farm built this really nice farm store, and it's been a really important part of the farm, and also an important part of the local economy. So they're selling stuff that they grow, and selling neighbor and regional crops there. And it's been, it was a big investment, and also it's been sort of an important piece of diversification there. So the Kitchen Garden Farm is another example where they invested in a big on-farm kitchen and processing facility. They don't grow all of their own peppers. They grow most of their own peppers and contract with some other local growers. They make this amazing sriracha and hot sauce and salsa and a bunch of other really dried chilies. And it has been just a game changer for their farm, because they spend all the winter months like in the kitchen processing all the peppers that they grew and froze during the summer. And it keeps their staff year round, so they don't have like these real peaks or ebbs and flows of employment, which is such an issue. So they're able to keep almost all of their staff on board year round, producing these value-added products. And it's been a real game changer. So that kind of product diversification is important. And then we see that too with a bunch of dairy farms that we work with, in terms of finding ways to either add value or create a local direct market for their products. And I think that that's worth really talking to folks about. Oh my gosh, that slide. Okay, I'm not going to read this. But I would recommend, like, if you want to get like deeper into crop rotation, I think that like there are really important principles, and you could also completely lose yourself in thinking about all the details. So in this resource that we'll send to you, there are awesome examples of Northeast farms and how they are doing various types of crop rotations. And I would say that like the most important thing is that farmers will see a benefit to rotating crops. And like every farmer who does it, almost every farmer I know has some form of crop rotation, right? They're rotating for either pests or diseases, or sometimes they're rotating for crop response. Like there is a real value in not having corn grown on the same ground every year. And people who start making that change of rotating through and growing some kind of legume in alternation, or growing hay for a few years and then moving it back into corn. There's just such value that is brought to that system by diversifying in the form of crop rotation. And the question is always how to do it. You know, it's like how to make that economically viable, how it can be not too labor intensive, or not complicate the system unduly. That's always the real challenge, but there are very few systems. The only one I actually know of is tobacco, where like people don't see a benefit from crop rotation. So the real question is kind of how and when. You know, I think that the kind of cool thing about the principle is that like you're always trying to moderate between extremes, right? So like you're trying to like alternate light feeders and heavy feeders. You're trying to alternate like weedy crops with highly cultivated crops. You're often trying to alternate between like above ground crops and below ground crops. So there's some of it that's just like keeping things in balance. That's kind of intuitive. There are a few things where they're just really disease prone. So like especially, you know, tomatoes, eggplant, peppers, rotating for disease is essential. And then there's a few insect pests too, where you really want to be thinking about rotating. Colorado potato beetle, flea beetles, wireworms. And there's a lot more information if this is something that you want to dig into. You could spend 3 hours talking about crop rotations. But I think that like if you have farmers you're working with where you really want to go in and be able to like talk about specifics, you know, there's a lot of great examples in this publication, where like examples of how folks who grow winter rye cover crops find that when they plant sweet potatoes afterwards, they have terrible wireworm pressure compared to when they don't grow a grass cover crop preceding sweet potatoes. So there's like a lot of really specific things where if you're working with farmers who are either having issues or who have a really valuable crop and they don't want to mess up their system, you can dive a lot deeper into it, but I think it's like too much detail to convey here. And yeah, I think I'll leave that one at that. Oh, look at that, we're at the end. So I have some resources. I'll send more. I would say that like these two books, if you're really interested in cover crops and you're working directly with farmers, the book on top, Northeast Cover Crop Handbook, it's quite old now, but it's awesome. You can, I don't know if Johnny still sells it. They used to. Rodale Institute sells it. I'm sure you can find it on Amazon. But if you only bought one book, that's the one. It's so good. And then the other incredibly valuable book is Managing Cover Crops Profitably, which you can download the PDF free online, and you can also order a paper copy if you like it. But that's, you know, if you owned 2 books about cover crops, those would be the ones. That's my contact info. I love talking about cover crops and soil health and climate adaptation. So I'm happy to make myself available to folks in the future.
Awesome. Thank you, Julie.
Sure.
Do you want to take a quick 5-minute break and then we'll come back and do some questions?
Sure.
Awesome. So yeah, folks, if you need a bio break, please feel free. Please put some more questions in the chat if you have them, and we will be right back. Hi, everyone, and welcome back. We're going to go through some questions, and if you would like rather raise your hand and speak a question, please feel free to do that as well in turn. We wanted to leave plenty of time for questions, especially in this particular webinar, because I know there's lots of them. And so this first question is from Mel. Curious if you can speak to the connection between cover crops and climate change. I assume that they will help improve climate resilience, but I'm also wondering if climate impacts, flooding, longer growing seasons will make cover crop management easier or more difficult in Vermont.
That's a good question. Well, so there's like probably 3 questions in there, right? So cover crops and climate change, like I would say that when you ask farmers, like in surveys that have been done, through, primarily at UVM, but also a survey that AFT did among 400 Massachusetts farmers, the number one answer when you ask a farmer how they're adapting to climate change, they say soil health. So, and the rationale there, right, is that it's like they're increasing their soil fertility, they're protecting themselves from erosion by increasing soil organic matter. They're managing healthier soil so that when there is an extreme weather event, the soil bounces back better, it has better biological activity. Well aggregated soil is sort of the primary characteristic of a resilient soil to extreme rain. So I would say that cover crops are one of the most powerful soil health tools, and so that I would say that the real connection between cover crops and soil adaptation is pretty strong in terms of being a really powerful tool for soil health. But I would say in terms of like climate change and climate mitigation, right? There it's actually possible to grow like a really legume heavy cover crop that can actually contribute methane to the atmosphere if it's tilled in under certain conditions. It basically that nitrogen isn't necessarily utilized and can actually off gas. So like it is possible for cover crops to actually contribute to climate change. But those circumstances are sort of rare and they're more common in cropping systems that we don't have here in like Vermont, Massachusetts, New Hampshire. Those conditions tend to happen more in commodity production systems. But definitely I would say cover crops are just a hugely powerful thing in terms of improving climate resilience, in part because one of the things that we know we'll see increasingly over the next 50 years is winter precipitation in the form of rain instead of snow. And so, in frozen soils, you're holding on to a lot of that nitrogen, not all of it, but you're protecting soil with the physical protection of snow and with the physical protection of frozen water in soil. But if soils aren't frozen and there's a lot more infiltration, you get both more surface erosion, but then you also get a lot more nutrient runoff. You get nutrient runoff like vertically through the soil, and you also get surface runoff that's just washing away both nutrients and topsoil. So cover crops are just kind of the only thing we have for protecting soils in the winter. And our winters are long, so it's essential. And I think that's part of why people grow so much winter rye, because you can plant it really late, and we need that as a tool in the toolbox. But I would say that in terms of like protecting soils in winter and spring, cover crops are really where it's at. I think in terms of, it's funny, the longer growing season should actually help us in terms of cover cropping, right? We have 2 extra weeks to get cover crops established and to grow cash crops. So my hope is that that's sort of a silver lining of the changes that we're seeing to weather patterns. And I would say that there are a few farms that I've talked to too, where they're growing summer cover crops. And when they have something bad happen, they have a field flooded, it actually is like a form of insurance, right? They can actually till in that cover crop and go in and plant something that they needed to plant for fall cropping. It provides like a little buffer. So I would say that it also can provide a little bit of like space cropping resilience in that way too.
Thanks, Julie.
Yeah.
Got another question here from Sarah. Just wondering how common agroforestry is around Vermont and New England in general. Is there anything about our climate that makes it difficult to implement?
Oh, it's growing really fast. It's pretty exciting, and I think it's growing faster than we have the expertise to implement it. It's not something. It's a fairly resource intensive investment, and so I think that planting trees is expensive, and having the time to maintain them can also be a big labor investment. And so, and then planting the right species and planting them the right way and managing them well to get something established really well it's not, it's complicated. It's like, I think there's a lot of things in agriculture, right, where we're like, you plant a seed, you grow it. It's not that complicated. But in fact, the whole system is really complex, and doing it well is really complex. So I would say that, like, I think the limiting factors for agroforestry are really the expertise that's required to select good species, to design a plan well, to get proper spacing, and to help farmers know how to manage it well. And I think that that expertise is growing quickly too. And I think that I'm excited that Megan is coming to talk to you, because she's really like the person that I go to with questions around that. But in some ways, New England is the perfect place for agroforestry, because we have a real potential for these diversified systems. We're not Iowa, where there isn't a market for tree crops or for growing animals, where it's like corn and soybeans, right? So we have diversified marketplaces, we have local food systems, and there's a lot of things that I think really support regenerative agriculture in that way. And our landscape is a forested landscape. Most of New England is trees, and most of our fields were forests before they were fields. So we certainly have the right climate for it. And I think the expertise is growing. And I also know that, NRCS in most states in New England is starting to really fund agroforestry practices, which is pretty exciting. That's a big change compared to just a few years ago. And so I see that Kat put in here a link to someone that's helping, and it sounds like you guys are going to have some other good resources too. But I think that that's, like, in terms of increasing farm resilience, I think that is a exciting growth niche.
Thanks, Julie. And yeah, just for the recording purposes, Kat shared that there is a farm to plate agroforestry committee that's a connector group, and they're developing a species list and doing lots of other good work. So check out their work. And then Willie also added in about climate change, that he would say climate change makes cover cropping even more important and a higher return on investment when applied well. It may be easier, but it also may be more complicated, as planting and termination timing are so crucial.
Totally. I agree with that entirely. I mean,
Wonderful.
it's really interesting, because, like, people often find cover cropping expensive. But people, when they do it well and they find the right way to fit it into their system, they never go back, right? They find the return on investment and the value to be there, in all kinds of years. And I would say, especially when we don't know what kind of weather extreme we're going to have, most cover crops and the soil organic matter, the organic matter that they provide, are really valuable in terms of helping our soils be more resilient. So it's mostly a matter of, like, getting the right fit, getting things planted in time, and having appropriate management.
Wonderful. I'm going to keep coming with more questions. Soph asked, what would the best termination method be for super small scale contexts, or for those without access to specialized equipment? I was humbled by winter rye when I used it as a cover crop in a raised bed school garden. I naively thought I could chop and drop the above ground growth to retain the root biomass in the soil, but it just kept growing back instead of dying. Perhaps occultation. I'm
Yeah, that's a great
sure I
question.
pronounced that wrong.
No, you did. That was right. Occultation.
Wonderful.
That's a great question. So it's funny, because winter rye is such a common farm cover crop, but in a garden setting, it's just totally brutal. And you're right, occultation, either tarping something, or sometimes people have luck with cardboard, but mostly tarps and plastic mulch. That's really the best way to kill rye. The other thing that's interesting about winter rye is that it's more susceptible at different growth stages. So it's easy to kill when it's small, and it's easy to kill when it's nearing maturity. And anywhere in between there, it's really hard to kill. So part of it is just getting it at the right time. So it's a little easier for it to not grow back when it's, like, all of its growth hormones are putting into reproduction, and it's actually forming seeds. The seeds are kind of, you can peel open the little seed head and find, like, a soft a rye seed in there. That, at that point, the plant, like, sort of can't come back from being really chopped down. So that's another trick. But I would say that in garden context, other species are just better. If you're able to use silage tarps to occultate and kill them, that works really well for most people. They'll often trample it and then tarp it. Or sometimes, depending on how big your garden space is, you can just kind of like throw the tarp down and smash it down and weight it down, and that's sufficient. And it usually takes, it takes a while to kill it. And that's the other disadvantage. It is that occultation takes, 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the temperatures. It dies faster the warmer it is. But so in spring, it can actually take a month to kill rye. So I think a lot of gardens tend to use winter killed cover crops for that reason. It's just a lot easier to manage. And then there's also some folks who are using other winter species that are just less vigorous. So some folks are using tillage radish. Other folks are doing, for things that actually overwinter, there are definitely folks who use like winter wheat because it is just a weaker plant and has a weaker root system, which is an advantage or a disadvantage, right? But if you're using it in a garden setting where you want to either like yank it or decapitate it, winter wheat is often, and sometimes people use barley. They're a little better choice. Although the truth is, I find cover cropping in gardens to be much more difficult than cover cropping in field scale agriculture. So just admit that freely.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, keep the questions coming, everyone. I did actually want to dive in. One of my questions, I know a lot of the dairy farmers up here are doing winter wheat, winter rye combos and trying some of those out. And I was wondering if you could speak to maybe why they're testing those or what kind of benefits they might see from that combination.
They're doing mixtures or they're
Yeah,
doing,
like a 50-50.
oh, interesting.
Yeah.
And then what do they do at maturity?
So I'm not totally sure. And I was hoping you might know. I'm not sure
Yeah.
how they're
Well,
terminating.
and these are dairy farmers or yeah. So I know that in a number of farmers that I've worked with are trying to do more sort of what do we call it? Like dual use cover cropping, right? So they're growing some of their cover crop for feed. And at least in the farmers that I've worked with, the favorite species is triticale. It's really nutritious. It grows really fast in the spring. Most folks are establishing it in October after they harvest their corn silage, and then it takes off in spring and they cut it. And they get usually just one cutting off of it. Some folks are getting two, but it's not as it's just not as productive once you cut it once because it's an annual. It's like really not bred to be for multi-cut. And so they're doing that, and then they actually spray it and no-till plant corn into that. And so they pick for the following season. They pick like a short season corn with fewer days to maturity, and they're doing that like they're kind of swapping it. So they have like some fields that are like winter triticale harvested in spring with a short day corn after it, and then other fields where they're just growing long day corn, and they kind of swap those every other year. And that way they get, this really nutritious spring feed from the triticale. But it does make it so that you have to grow a slightly lower yielding short day corn. And so it's not worth it to do it on all of their fields. So they'll do it kind of half and half. So that's the most successful system that I've seen on dairy farms. And there are folks I've seen who are trying winter wheat or sometimes winter barley because it's earlier maturing. So I can't remember the exact dates of triticale. Well, and you guys are further north, but with triticale, it's something like mid-May that you're getting your primary harvest, and with wheat, it's often like the first week of May or the 1st of May. So those 2 weeks can make a really big difference in terms of getting silage corn in on time. And I don't know, like so many things, it also seems really site specific. Like I've talked to folks who've had a really hard time with triticale, but they've had an okay time with winter wheat. There's also sometimes seed prices that make people choose one or another. Like I'm wondering with the winter wheat if they're doing that because the winter wheat matures more quickly. Sometimes also people, because rye, like the other reason I can think that they would be doing that rye wheat mixture is that rye just establishes more quickly. So you might get like a better winter soil protection with the rye, but then come spring, both of those grasses take off and you have the wheat maturing more quickly. So you can go in and harvest the 1st of May and you have like this really vigorous wheat crop, but then you got the benefit of the cover crop all winter. The other interesting thing about winter rye that I should just mention before I forget is that it's a cool season crop. It's called winter rye for a reason. It does not like warm weather. So there are people actually who plant winter rye in the spring and they just know that it's going to punk out once the weather gets warm. And so that's kind of an interesting tool. You can plant a cover crop at the wrong time if you want to weaken it eventually, right? I'm looking at Abby's note here. Dairy's moved away from rye to winter wheat or winter rye combo because the winter wheat grows less aggressively in the spring, right? Because you don't want to manage 6 feet tall rye in the spring necessarily. You'd rather manage a more reasonable winter rye. It's just shorter.
Awesome. And then I just wanted to add back to the previous question about terminating in gardens. Willie suggested stomp it, roll it, and at full pollination stage, he's seen 2 people using a plank the width of a bed with ropes attached and stepping on the plank down on pollinating rye. So basically rolling it, kind of like a 3-legged sack race. And that was a great visual, Willie. Thank you very much.
There's some great YouTube videos that too.
Wonderful. Another question I had, and again, if anyone else has questions, please speak up or toss them in the chat. I'm on the Lake Champlain basin side of the state, and so we always talk about phosphorus, and I know you talked a lot about nitrogen with cover crops, and I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit towards how cover crops can be beneficial in the phosphorus cycle.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I think that I probably was speaking a lot about nitrogen because I think that sometimes cover crops are underutilized for recycling nitrogen. People kind of grow a cover crop and they write off the nitrogen value because they don't really know how to calculate it, and it does depend on a lot of like temperature and soil moisture and soil biological activity. I'm sorry, I should have mentioned phosphorus more, but I think that you know, phosphorus is moving right off farms through both surface water and through infiltrated water. So cover crops are really good at holding soil particles together and preventing that surface runoff, and also preventing, taking phosphorus up into their tissue and preventing it moving either vertically or horizontally. So they're incredibly functional in terms of preventing that. Like it's basically like phosphorus erosion, right? But you have to get the cover crop established early enough that there's actually enough like plant material to prevent that erosion, and enough roots to actually hold those aggregates in place. So it's one of those things where they can be a really powerful tool for preventing phosphorus loss as long as they're given enough time to actually establish well. And I think that, that's always a challenge for us when we're trying to really grow food for all of the growing season. And I think, in other parts of the country, there are more folks who are, I think in part because of being on a larger scale and having more investment in equipment. I think because of the small scale of our agriculture in New England, we have less industry interested in developing equipment that we need. And so you see, in Pennsylvania and New York, more people who have interseeders and who are finding ways to get cover crops established earlier. And I know that there are folks in Vermont who are working on that. But I would say that it's still sort of slow to trickle down to on-farm use. And because the investment in that equipment is prohibitive, and also one of the beautiful things about our agriculture is that it is sort of diversified. People have a lot of different operations, and so it's hard to have enough specialized equipment. but I think that that's another real opportunity, is finding ways for equipment sharing and for grant funding for equipment that will help farmers interseed so they actually get cover crops established early enough to do that phosphorus holding.
Awesome. Thank you very much. You mentioned on a previous question, I should have asked it immediately after, you mentioned short day corn and long day corn, or shorter day and longer day. And if you wouldn't mind like defining what you mean just for the whole group, and kind of some of the aspects there and how that impacts cover crops.
Yeah. So folks who are growing corn for either silage or grain, there are different varieties that are they're basically bred. I mean, they're often bred actually for the number of days to maturity. They have many other traits too, right? But one of the defining features of field corn varieties, is their days to maturity. It's really important for a number of reasons. One is that in order to maximize biomass, right, people are growing day to maturity corn that will grow as long as it can, so they get like the most production out of it before harvest and before the cool weather comes, and days shorten, and they have to bring it in. So it's like corn day length is like a balance between maximizing the biomass and getting the crop to maturity before fall. And so and it's different on different fields, right? Depending if there's shade, if it's wet, if you can't plant it until later because you have a wet spring. And so choosing the right day length corn is like an art and science, and something that farmers think about a lot. Some of them don't think about it, and they just plant the same thing every year. But it is a powerful tool if you're wanting to find a way to fit in that overwintered cover crop, and then choose a corn variety that has fewer days to maturity so that you can plant it, June 15th instead of June 1st. And then you can still pull off a fully mature corn crop in the fall. But it gives you a little more wiggle room in spring to manage around a cover crop. And usually the shorter day length varieties produce they yield lower. And so people are planting them only when it provides an advantage, like when that's the most they can get off of a wet, cold field, or when it's worth it to them to grow like triticale in the spring.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that explanation. We've got a question from Jennifer. Can you speak briefly on herbicide carryover from the previous crop when planting a cover crop?
Yeah. Oof. It's hard. It's hard to speak really specifically because and actually it's not, I should also say it's not my area of expertise. So, but I can include some great resources that are available on the internet that will specify concerns around that. Most of the time, the concern is when you're planting a grass cash crop and a grass cover crop. So when you're terminating your winter rye and then planting corn, you definitely have to you have to select your herbicide properly. And that's like the limit of my knowledge. So I'll try and point you to a better resource. Probably, if there are any dairy farmers here, folks who work with dairy farmers, they know more about it than I do.
Awesome, thanks.
And then usually the issue is around grasses.
Okay. Willie, I'm wondering if you want to come off mute and speak a little bit to your comment in the chat. If not, I can certainly read it.
Yeah, I'll try. It's been a little noisy here, so I will if you like. So I just I'm really grateful for this conversation, by the way. This is marvelous. Thank you very much. So regarding the phosphorus question, I just wanted to kind of add in also about considering using arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi inoculants, and whether you use them with your cover crop or if you've been able to get them included in your cropping system so you can be pretty assured that they're really effective in your soil. I've had a lot of experience over the last several years with seeing the benefits of a really good inoculant. And of course, the mycorrhizal fungi are noted for grabbing phosphorus from the soil that probably would have gone eventually into the groundwater or the tile drain water. And if we can bring it to the plant, then the plant needs it. So we'd want to be, planting cover crops, particularly the grasses that are going to want to form a grain, and then also like buckwheat, known for wanting to scarf up quite a bit of phosphorus. But I would encourage people to really look into using a good mycorrhizal fungi inoculant. And, don't need to use it every time they plant a seed, but I would encourage it on any piece of ground at least every couple of years, every few years if possible, and add an inoculant, make sure it's working well.
Thanks, Willie. Yeah, Julie, do you want to speak to that a bit more too?
Well, thanks for that, Willie. I think that the only thing I would want to add to that is that there's this. I was just also thinking about like how you encourage mycorrhizal fungi in your soils, right? So like adding them is great, and also cultivating an environment where they can thrive in your soils is good. And tillage discourages, all of those beneficial fungi. And so I think that like, that's reducing tillage has all of these benefits. So in terms of like, improving soil health and preventing erosion, and also encouraging microbial activity that will benefit your plants and your soil aggregates and nutrient runoff. So I think that like, when you're thinking about cover crops, part of it is figuring out like, how can I use cover crops to actually reduce tillage, and not just like add them in so that then it's another thing you have to till into your soil. But like being a little strategic, knowing that reducing tillage is like one of the primary things you can do to promote soil health. I remember, so in my graduate research, I looked at like biomass production and how much above ground biomass production you had to grow in a cover crop to increase soil organic matter significantly, like year over year. And it's massive. You have to grow a cover crop that's like 6 feet tall, incredibly lush, and well balanced in terms of a carbon nitrogen ratio to increase your soil organic matter year over year. And if you're tilling every, twice a year, you basically undo all of that contribution just by oxidation. So anything that you can do to reduce the amount of tillage you're doing is also serving all of these functions in terms of, maintaining the benefits that cover crops are providing and conserving all of that nutrient loss and contributing to soil health.
Sure, agree with that. Mm-hmm.
Easier said than done, of course, but I do think that people are really interested. I see this huge increase in tillage reduction in across all kinds of farms, actually, in part because it's like it's a win-win. It usually like reduces inputs, it saves costs, and it promotes soil health. And so as long as people can find ways that it fits into their system without decreasing crop quality, it's like an exciting challenge to figure out how to reduce tillage, especially in diversified systems.
I'm going to follow along that kind of thread. I know a lot of people are using pesticides and herbicides to terminate their cover crops. And just wondering, I guess one thing that this might be my own misconceived notion is that a lot of cover crops are in annual systems where herbicides are being used kind of anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so people are trying to time them and when they're terminating things to when they would be normally spraying their new crop anyway. I'm just wondering if you could speak kind of to the additional pesticide use, or on places where they weren't necessarily using pesticides before, does the benefit outweigh the cost?
So the question is like, if you're well, I guess, I mean, like so many things, the answer is kind of like, it depends. So I would say that most people who are growing annual crops, they have to start off in the spring with a clean slate anyway. They're either tilling or they're spraying to kill spring weeds and prevent initial weed germination at the start of the growing season. So that is either happening through tillage or through herbicide. And so if you're terminating a preceding cover crop, you're using either herbicide or tillage for that anyway. So in some ways, it's sort of going to happen anyway. You do have to apply more volume of herbicides to kill a high biomass cover crop. So it's one of those tricky things. Like, I came into agriculture as a sort of diehard organic grower, and the more that I've seen, the more flexible I've become. Even though, you know, there's the science shows that herbicides are not, they're damaging in all kinds of ways, but they're also such a powerful tool in reducing tillage and allowing for cover crop growth. Like what folks are doing in the Midwest with cover crops that rely on herbicide termination is awesome, and it wouldn't be possible without herbicides. And so I think, like anything, it's either a powerful tool or a destructive tool, depending on how you use it. And I think that, like, if people are spraying in the spring anyway to reduce weeds, if you can have a double purpose of terminating your cover crop and knocking down weeds, then there's an advantage to that.
And there's a follow-up question from Mel. I've spoken to some organic farmers that have said they don't use both no-till and cover crops because they would need to use herbicides. What would be your recommendation to them?
Yeah, that's for real right there. Like that is the crux. Like, if someone can figure that out, I was going to say that they'd make millions, but you're never going to make millions farming. But yes, that is the hard part. And actually that's like something that I've been trying to work on in my work at AFT. I have these cohorts of organic vegetable farmers who are trying to reduce tillage. And so we're trying to sort of build this farmer to farmer networking and brainstorming and you know, having like a real practicum where people can say, here's what I tried and I used this equipment and here's what went wrong. And other farmers can either sympathize or advise. And it's been really interesting, and it is really hard. And so the challenge is real. I would say that what I see being successful is organic farmers who are able to focus on particular crops where they can be successful to reduce tillage. So there are things like tomatoes where you don't need a fine seed bed, or winter squash or pumpkins, or sweet corn where you can skip spring tillage if you've sort of set yourself up for success with a preceding cover crop. And you can use other tools to improve, you know, like you can make beds without tilling, or you can plant straight into a flat field instead of making beds so that you don't have to till in preparation. So there are some tricks that work well for specific crops, but what I do see with organic, especially organic vegetable farmers, is there's nothing that works for everything unless you're at like a very small scale and you can use tarps. But I would say for small scale organic growers, tarping has become a really popular and really successful strategy for managing weeds and managing cover crops without herbicides. But man, at that like medium to large scale, it is really a challenge. I don't know if you guys have run across, I work a lot with Lincoln Fishman, who is heading up this cool research collaboration of farmers across the Northeast who are interested in using perennial Dutch white clover as a living mulch. And he's been doing all these cool experiments transplanting into living mulch. And you can look him up. His group is called Momentum Ag, and he's actually paying farmers. He's started this nonprofit to pay farmers to run these trials where they're establishing perennial white clover. It grows for a year, and then using different types of equipment depending on what you have, transplanting. The most successful things so far have been brassicas, but there are other crops. I've seen a really successful crop of tomatoes that's grown in like a living clover mulch. So that is like one tool that I've seen work on organic farms, which is kind of interesting. It doesn't work for everything, but it works in these niches.
Thanks, Julie. And then we've got a comment in the chat from Kat. I love the potential cascading effects of employing cover crops in regards to climate resilience and nutrient cycling, especially. A great multi-solving tool. Plants, Plants are such great teachers. This has been a fantastic presentation and your passion shines through, Julie. Thank you. And now that I've built you up, I'm going to ask you a hard one. Oh, sorry, Kat also asked, could you repeat the person's name you were just talking about? Lincoln something?
I'll put it in the chat.
Perfect.
Oh, it's Lincoln Fishman.
Lincoln Fishman. I'm wondering, we're saying winter rye, we're saying buckwheat. Are there local varieties, or does where you're sourcing your cover crop seed matter for climate adaptation as well to where you're trying to grow them and what is establishing when?
Oh, that's a tough question. Yes and no. I mean, most, yes, there are places where you can buy really specific varieties of lots of cover crops. Like Albert Lee has, and King's Agri-Seed, they have varieties of cover crops that are bred for certain functions. So like if you want to use like winter rye or triticale for both a cover crop and for feed, they have varieties that are bred for that. So those are two places to look for seed if you're looking to have something with a very particular function. I would say for most of us, like winter rye is winter rye. There are different for pea cover crops. There are very different species and different varieties, so those are something to look more carefully at. Like Austrian winter peas are much more cold tolerant, and so they'll grow longer into the fall. And in parts of Massachusetts, they overwinter really well. And that they're one of the few. And it's a little hit or miss depending on how cold it gets. But so that variety is like really specific and important to make a distinction between that and just a regular field pea. And then all clovers are really different, and they're really again those two companies that I mentioned, King's Agri-Seeds and Albert Lee, they have really specific clover varieties too that most of us aren't needing something that's sort of that high performing. They're more expensive and but they're out there. I would say that in general, for most people who are just sort of doing like fall planted peas and oats, winter rye and vetch, anything from the feed store, from any seed company will do. There is some interesting work being done on hairy vetch, which has a certain percentage of hairy vetch seed has like a hard seed coat. So if your vetch accidentally goes to seed, or it has an indeterminate flower, so some of the early flowers will go to seed before the later flowers do. So you might actually have a little seed formation in your hairy vetch. And if like 5% of those are this hard seed coat, they will live in your soil and come back as a weed. And they can really be a pain because hairy vetch is very tangly. So if it like comes up again in your soil and you're growing carrots, it's going to get tangled in your cultivators and it's really a giant pain. So a lot of vegetable farmers I work with actually don't put hairy vetch in their mix anymore because of this hard seed coat problem. And there is an effort in the USDA to actually breed northern varieties of hairy vetch that don't make that hard seed coat so that we can grow vetch more without having that problem, without vetch becoming a weed. I don't know where that's at. It's been a few years since I've checked on whether that's becoming commercially available, but I know that there was an effort and that the Northeast Cover Crop Council was part of that. I feel like that was a really rambling answer, but
no, I think that was great. Sometimes you need to just get through all the thoughts. That was really wonderful. Another question, and again, if other folks have questions, please keep putting them in the chat. I hope everyone else is enjoying my conversation with Julie. I was wondering about spring broadly. And so obviously if it's a wet spring, it's hard to get out onto fields to terminate cover crops and to plant your plants.
Right.
So if you could speak a little bit to how tile drainage might impact that, how tile drainage impacts cover cropping in general, and then just really about these really wet springs and what maybe some creative ideas to work around that is.
Yeah. Well, I think, there, tile drainage, at least in my part of the world, is pretty controversial. It's like, it's really great when it works well, and it's really bad when it works badly. Um, and also around here, we have a hard time actually finding installation options. So there, I think it's different in Vermont. But I would say, there's a real advantage in terms of just being able to get into really saturated ground in the spring if you have tile drainage. And certainly cover crops are, I think, really, really important in tile drained fields, because they're holding on to nutrients, they're holding on to phosphorus and nitrogen while all that water is moving through the soil profile. So if you're really trying to retain nutrients in your soil, cover crops are going to do that while the water is draining out. So I think maybe cover crops are even more important when you have tile drainage, because you have more water flow during those heavy rain events. The other thing I would say about wet springs is just that, that's why it's so great to fall plant a winter hardy cover crop, because then you don't have to go in and plant something in the spring. It's going to grow in response to the weather. So it's going to grow the right amount when there's warmth and sun, and it's going to poke along when there isn't. And then you don't have to be driving around on wet fields, like trying to seed a spring cover crop. I think spring cover crops can be also a real disadvantage because they can shade the soil and actually keep soil wetter longer in the spring if you have high biomass cover crop. So there are definitely people who, and that is one of the advantages of being able to use herbicides, is people go in and actually like spray rye when it's a foot tall, because they have a certain piece of ground that they know is going to stay wet longer if they let the cover crop like grow up and shade it and cool it. So again, you have to sort of be strategic about how you use them. The other thing I would say is that like a lot of more and more with the unpredictable spring weather and wet springs, more and more farmers I talk to are hesitant to plant spring cover crops. So like it used to be that a lot of people would, like a lot of vegetable farmers in particular, would plant oats and peas in the spring and then, till them in, and their second succession would follow that. But it's like, if it's cold and wet, they just don't grow. And then you basically are kind of like promoting weed growth. The weeds take over and they do better than the oats and peas do in a cold, wet spring. And so there's some folks that I have talked to who are really moving away from spring planted cover crops for that reason, because of our wetter, cooler springs.
Thank you. Got a question here from Soph. Curious about your thoughts about native plant species with cover cropping potential. It seems like most commercially used cover crops are non-native and even considered invasive in some states.
That's a great question. Someone was just asking about cover cropping with like wildflower seed. I think that the challenge, right, is that also, I'm just gonna start by saying this is like, I'm coming up with an answer here, but like my specialty is definitely in like non-native annual species. So I can share what I do know. But that, almost many cover crops are annual species just because they're easier to manage. You can kill them easier. They grow faster. So that's part of why people are using kind of non-native annual species and as a cover crops. I do think that like there is I'm actually trying to think of like, I think a lot of native species are harder to establish on a field scale. They have very small seeds, and they have really like more durable root systems that are actually harder to terminate. So I think that there's some just sort of basic physiological things about a lot of native species that make them harder to grow. And they often tend to grow more slowly and get established more slowly. So it's harder for them to outcompete weeds. So I think that's sort of why you don't see it. There are definitely though a few people that I know who are like sort of cultivating not native species and then how do you say, sort of like cycling through that area. So letting a small field sort of be seeded with native species and grow that way for a couple of years, and then they actually go back and till it and bring it back into sort of annual production. So that's really the only thing I've seen in terms of using native species as cover crops. If anyone else has anything to contribute, I'd love to know more about that myself.
Not related to that, but it looks like Willie also was talking back to the winter rye varieties, and he said the variety of winter rye matters if you want to roll. You need the earliest anthesis. I don't think that's how you pronounce that.
Anthesis.
Anthesis, thank you. Like Arustock. I'm so sorry. This is a good one, Willie. You're really stumping me here. For roller and crimping, Albert Leah had the array of small grains and other great covers. King's Agri Seeds has very good covers, including oats, but not other small grains.
Yeah.
Thank you. And then I'm going to throw a not cover crop question at you. So cover crops are useful in annual systems. Crop rotations are useful in crop rotation systems. But in Vermont, there are a lot of grass and pasture areas. And so I guess just thinking about how to get diversification into perennial, continuous grass systems. I know I've talked with farmers about frost seeding clovers, but just trying to think through if you have any thoughts on adding diversity into grass systems where oftentimes there's really competitive grasses that just win.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing that's just kind of real, like often grasses win. And I think that often people have to really manage pastures for less strong species. And also there just is a need. Legumes are also often shorter lived, and so there is often a need to reseed pastures with legume species after a few years. So I think that it's there's some great webinars, and I'll make a note to try and include a link to that. But there's some great webinars about reseeding and reestablishing a more diverse species in pasture. And also there's, I don't know if any of you are going, this at the end of this week is the Northeast Grazing Conference at UMass, which should be really good. And I know that there's a speaker on that topic. Frost seeding is like a really sort of beautiful old-fashioned practice that really works. Like, you know, it's something that people have been doing for centuries, really, especially with clovers, and is really successful. I've also seen a number of vegetable farmers who've started to actually frost seed clover into winter rye, to get just a little, well, for two reasons. Some of these folks who are working with Lincoln on developing these perennial clover systems, you can actually seed clover into winter rye and it comes up. I actually almost put a picture of it in my presentation and then I didn't get to it, but the clover germinates and it kind of pokes along all spring, and the rye is very protective of the clover as it's getting itself established. Clover doesn't like to get too dry or too hot, and so, like, you know, you frost seed in, you know, early April or something, the clover comes up, it pokes along all of May and June, and then when you terminate the rye, even if you are mowing it, the clover then is like, ooh, sunlight, and it pops up and just grows like crazy. So people definitely are finding that kind of it's almost like a succession, you know, that is really successful. And there's one other thing I was going to say in response to that. Yeah, I think also one of the other things that in terms of crop rotation and pasture is that there are real benefits to actually there are times when it's really beneficial to go back in and totally renovate a pasture, or to do like a corn hay rotation. And so I know a lot of folks in Vermont, right, who are doing like a 3-year, it's like, I can't remember the numbers, it's like 3 years in hay and 4 years in corn or something like that. So it's like a 7-year rotation. where you get these tremendous soil health benefits from the hay, kind of builds the soil back up, and then you go back into corn. So that, I mean, that's like an alternative strategy, right? That and its own form of diversification.
Thanks, Julie. Do you mind just describing how frost seeding works as a practice too, in case there's some folks who don't know?
Yeah, so frost seeding is where you go out in the early spring when it's still, you're still having this freeze thaw cycle. And with our springs now, you know, sometimes that's March and sometimes it's April. And but around that time of year, you know, as the ground is freezing and thawing, these like little micro cracks open and close. And so you go out when it's frozen, and the cracks are widest open, and you either drive across the fields with like a broadcast seeder, or a lot of people still do it by hand. And you just spread the clover seed. It's really small seed, so it's easy to throw out like a fair amount pretty easily. And then the clover actually kind of settles into all the nooks and crannies and cracks in the soil and starts to germinate, and it can handle getting cold. So it, I mean, the clover is the most successful frost seeding species, but you can't do it with peas. But I'm sure there's some species I'm not thinking of right now that also work for frost seeding. And so even though it's really cold and it's still freezing and thawing, that those seeds start absorbing water, and they start slowly germinating, and they settle into these sort of open spots in the ground, and then they grow slowly as the soil warms, and they're still faster establishing than some of the grasses. So they kind of keep up with the grass as the grass is waking up in the spring, and they get the protection, the spring protection from those other grasses. If they don't like being, I think I said before, they don't like being too hot or too dry, so they actually appreciate the protection of the surrounding grasses. And it's also just so fun to go out there on like a cold March morning and throw seeds on a pasture and come back a couple months later and have this beautiful legumes growing.
Wonderful. Thanks, Julie. I'm going to toss in a couple more comments from the chat. Kevin says, I've seen many more native ground covers in agroforestry settings.
Right.
And then Willie said Galansoga is almost always an excellent native cover crop.
It's the worst weed.
And then just lots of thanks and gratitude heading your way as well. I think since it's 3:58, I'm going to transition us out of Q&A and into prep for the next class.
Great.
And so let me just
thank you all.
Hop that up here. So we hope to see everyone next week. Again, same time, same place. It'll be January 30th. Oh my gosh, it's already the end of January. We'll be talking about minimizing tillage with Abby Hogarten and Jeff Sanders from UVM Extension. As always, please do fill out that evaluation form. Your responses are helpful, and we do appreciate when you do fill them out. Even if you just want to tell us we're doing a great job, we'll take that too. If we're not doing a great job, that is very important for us to hear as well. Think about cover crops this week and what you've seen on farms, and talk to your friends about it. Our homework for next week will be chapter 16, minimizing tillage. And then, as Julie mentioned, we'll also get the campus page updated with some of the resources she shared today and some of the additional ones she said she had to go and look up for us. And with that, I believe Mel has probably put the link in the chat. Yep, for the evaluation form. And does look like there's one more comment from Willie. All small, roundish, hard seeds that like cool, moist germination time will usually work. Also, some of the smaller, denser grass seeds. He likes frost seeding early winter and December, so he doesn't have time to do it perfectly in the spring. That's great information and feedback. Thank you, Willie. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Julie, for being an excellent presenter and taking all of our questions, especially 400 from me. And we just really appreciate your time and your knowledge. And thank you to everyone for being here and sticking with us. We'll see you all next week.
Thanks.